So they made a Christian horror movie about a book that's going to save the world, and it's not the Bible? Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out the introduction video. There's a link to it in the description below, and it'll give you a pretty good overview of what the Horror Movie Syllabus is all about. Basically, we look at a particular subgenre of horror, and then we pick 3 movies from that subgenre to explore. But today is the Is It Syllabus-Worthy series. This is a little different. This is where I take a recommendation from you guys of a horror movie that I've never seen before. I watch it, and then I let you guys know, is it syllabus worthy? Is it worthy of being mentioned on the horror movie syllabus with all of these other important or legendary or great films? And today, the movie that we're looking at is Nefarious. And Nefarious was recommended by Sky Cavilt, and I'm not 100% sure I'm pronouncing that right, so hopefully I am. But Sky recommended this in our Possession Doctor Level video, the Doctor Level video being a revisiting of the Possession subgenre. And it is interesting because when I went back to look at Sky's comment regarding this recommendation, I couldn't find it. I don't know why it's not there anymore, but I couldn't find it. So all I have to go on was that it was recommended on a Possession video, so it's probably something to do with Possession. But otherwise, I knew nothing else about this movie going into it other than it's about possession. And that's actually an assumption, just because that's the video that it was recommended under. So I really didn't know anything. I was very much in the dark on this one, which is kind of fun sometimes, but also, can really go either way depending on your mood. If you're in the mood for one thing and you're getting something else, that can be a little bit difficult. But anyways, I dove into this one, eyes shut, basically no trailer, no synopsis, nothing. And did I like it? Did I hate it? Well, let's find out. As I said, the movie we're talking about today is Nefarious. Nefarious came out in 2023, so fairly recently, and is written and directed by a man named Chuck Konzelman. But that's not the interesting part, I think, because I'm not really familiar with him. The interesting thing is that it's based on a book called A Nefarious Plot by a man named Steve Deese. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about Steve Deese throughout the video, because I think that that's a big and important influence on this movie, who he is as an influence on this movie and the people making this movie. And I think that that's an important thing to understand when you're watching this movie, what exactly it is you're in for. But we're going to get into all of that in just a minute. First, if you haven't seen the movie before, the story is about a psychiatrist who is asked to come in and evaluate a death row inmate who is scheduled to be executed, a serial killer who's been caught, who is claiming that he is possessed by a demon. And the psychiatrist's job is to evaluate whether or not he really is mentally stable to be executed or if they should stay his execution. And during their interview, he is pressed with a lot of questions to his faith and to his beliefs, and we'll leave it there so as to not spoil things too much for you, because the movie is interesting in that it hinges specifically on this conversation. That's the whole movie right there in a nutshell. The whole idea is that these 2 men are going to be in this room locked in together, having a conversation that is a wide-ranging conversation about personal beliefs and the world and how it works and demonology and theology. And it's an interesting and I think a really strong concept for a movie, especially a low-budget movie, which I'm pretty sure this is. This kind of setup accommodates a low budget. It's a single location, it's a minimal amount of actors, and it really is just being driven by your concept, by your story, and by your script and your actors. And that might be where there's a bit of a hiccup here. But overall, the concept is a strong one. I like this one. I'm really into this. I like theological discussions. That works for me. And that's a huge part of this movie, is discussing theology and debating it and questioning it. And that really leans into what I like. And so I was already in pretty early on this movie. But like I said, this movie is kind of depending on a couple of things And the setup is it's kind of like a Silence of the Lambs setup, right? The best parts of Silence of the Lambs is Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins facing off while he's in the cell, and them having these conversations that kind of go in these interesting places, and just the dynamic and the dialogue and the energy between the two of them. This movie is basically trying to make a whole movie out of just that concept, which I'm here for. But the catch is that it really depends on script and performance. It really, really does. And to be fair, these actors are not Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. Okay, so the performances in the movie are, I'll call them passable. They're not bad by any stretch of the imagination. There's nothing laughable here. There's nothing annoying here. There's nothing embarrassing here for the most part, I'd say. They're perfectly fine. But you really, if you're going to make a whole movie that's kind of like the Silence of the Lambs face-offs, you'd want it to have a similar crackling, a similar energy, similar powerhouse actors going at each other. And this movie just doesn't really have it. Maybe partly for budget, maybe for other reasons that we're going to get into in a minute. But the whole movie is set up like this, so you really need these two leads to anchor it, and they do okay. So you've got Sean Patrick Flannery as the convicted killer, and he's probably most famous for Boondock Saints. That's probably where most people would know him from. And he's a good actor. He's a good actor, and he's perfectly fine here. He's no Anthony Hopkins, but for the most part, I thought he was fine. He has this thing where he's doing these weird tics, and it's kind of like showing a little bit of like he's possessed, and it felt a little ham-fisted, a little hoary, a little bit much. But the tics aside, I thought he was pretty solid. His counterpart is a guy named Jordan Belfi, who I'm not really familiar with. He does a lot of TV work. I think his biggest thing is probably the show Entourage, which I watched. I don't remember him in this. And he's a little bit bland, if I'm being honest with you. Again, nothing wrong with his performance. He's a little bit bland. He's also playing somebody 10 years younger than him, which is noteworthy because they mentioned that he's supposed to be in his mid-30s, and dude is in his mid-40s, and you can tell it's somebody who's in his late 40s. Like, that dude wasn't fooling anybody at being 35 years old. No way. But that's a minor nitpick. But the guy's not bringing a lot of energy for Flannery to play off of, but he's serviceable. He's perfectly fine. He's delivering the lines with conviction. And I think that's actually the key thing here. Both actors are acting with conviction. They may not be crushing these roles, but they're really going for it. They're really trying to make it work and really trying to sell it. And for the most part, I think they're successful. They each really commit to their roles, and it makes me buy into it more. Like I said, neither of them are crushing it. Neither of them are amazing, but neither of them are bad. And the fact that they had committed so much into it, that especially Flannery, he really commits to this role of the possessed guy, or the supposedly possessed guy. And he is, like I said, it's maybe a little bit showy, a little bit much, but he's so committed to it that you kind of go with it. You stop thinking of it as like, this is a bit much and a little theatrical and a little bit, kind of showy. And you're just kind of like, yeah, okay, I'm buying into this now. I'm buying this. And by the end of the movie, I was tapped into him. I was really, he sold me. He sold me over the course of the movie. At first, I was like, meh. But as the movie went on, he sold me. And again, Belfi is just mostly non-offensive in this movie. He's really somebody for Flannery to play off of. I just wish that, like Jodie Foster, he was given as good as he got, and kind of making this interchange feel a little bit more evenly matched. But as a result, he's no Jodie Foster, and as a result, he's not doing that. So the scenes don't crackle like a Silence of the Lambs, and I keep making that comparison because that's all I could keep thinking about during the movie for good and bad reasons, like I'm explaining. Like, not a bad concept at all. And the topics of conversation were interesting. They were intriguing to me, but, and it's a big but, the messaging in those conversations is pretty heavy-handed. And when I did the research after this movie, looks like critics agreed with me. This is not a very highly rated or critically loved movie. And most of the critics seem to focus on this heavy-handed messaging. So if you're not familiar with Steve Deason, I wasn't. I had to look him up. He's a conservative talk show host and writer who has written a book called A Nefarious Plot, which this movie is based on. And he extols, typically conservative values and concepts in political positioning. And this movie is echoing a lot of that. I'm assuming because it's in the book. I haven't read the book. And so there is a lot of talk about things like abortion and euthanasia and atheism and just crime in general, which is all naturally flowing in this movie. I want to make it clear. It's not shoehorned in. It makes perfect sense in the plot completely. But the conservative positioning on this is very, very clear, and it's kind of clunky, if I'm being honest. The way that it's being delivered, the way that it's being espoused is kind of clunky. It's like, it's probably the way Steve Deese would be talking about this on his talk show. I've never seen it, but that's what my presumption would be. And I know a lot of people really don't like politics in their movies. They get really upset with this. I'm not actually one of those people. I kind of accept that the vast majority of movies have politics of some sort in there. And if you're really getting bothered by them, it's probably because they're not your politics. And when they are your politics, you don't really notice it so much. And I think the real key is, can you make your politics weave into your movie without it being heavy handed, without it being ham fisted? And this movie doesn't quite land that, but I don't feel like it derails the movie. It's obvious, like I noticed it. I was like, oh, that's a little bit heavy handed. It's a little bit obvious, but it wasn't so bad or so distracting that it took me completely out of the movie. And that is something that I usually factor in when I'm talking about a movie that, or even watching a movie that has like a certain political bent that's fairly obvious. Is, does this messaging outweigh the entertainment value? And in this case, I would say no. I would say no. The movie still had enough going for it that I could not really get hung up on the clunkiness of the message, regardless of whether or not I agree with the message. Which, a little bit of yes, a little bit of no. But I like that they were tackling theology very directly and asking questions that I think are very, very interesting, questions that I've asked myself. And the proselytizing that kind of comes out of it was fascinating, but it wasn't so distracting and ham-fisted and clunky and forced in that it was going to cause the movie to fail. The biggest issue I had with the movie was probably the fact that the actors were, A, not as good as I'd like them to be, and B, saddled with this dialogue. Like, the dialogue could be sharper. It's not bad. Again, it's just a little clunky. It's a little messagey. Frankly, given the clunkiness of the script, the actors did a really admirable job. Like, it's not the easiest thing to sell this dialogue. And they do a decent job. They give it their all. And so, like, the weakest thing about this movie is the script and the acting, and yet it's also probably its biggest strength, because it's focusing on that. And like, again, I wish the script was a little bit tighter, a little bit sharper written. Like, I don't even care about the messaging being in it so much as it was just the dialogue was crisper and sharper, and then the actor could maybe run with it a little bit, because again, at least Flannery, I've seen him in other things be good, and I don't really think that he is as good here as he's been in other things. And I think it's because it's a hard sell, this dialogue, and they did give it their all, and it's fine. It works out fine. So the question just becomes: is the concept, the theological idea, and the face-off between these two people enough to overcome these shortcomings and get it syllabus worthy? Well, let's find out. So, is Nefarious a syllabus worthy movie? I'm afraid not. It's not really going to measure up, primarily because the obvious place to be putting it would be in the possession subgenre, and that is probably one of the most competitive and fiercest subgenres to try to break into. There's just so many movies that are really great, that are frankly better than this one, better made, better executed, better thought out, better ideas, that are just going to beat it out, going to force it out. And then you start asking yourself, well, are there other subgenres that it could fit into? And yes, there's the religion subgenre. There's a serial killer subgenre that's coming up. Stay tuned for that. But those are also tough ones to crack. Like, religion would be a pretty good one to put this into, because it's very much focused on religion. Very much so. And your boy, I really like religious movies. I like that kind of stuff. So I'm really down for that. That really speaks to me. That really kind of gives it a bit of an advantage. But again, there's so many really great movies about religion. I don't think this one's going to make the cut. It's just not quite there enough. This is not to say that it's a bad movie. Like I say, it's perfectly fine. Actually, for me, better than fine. I actually enjoyed this movie, despite that it had, a clunky script, that the dialogue's not great. The actors kind of struggle with this. They don't really, sell it as much as I'd like. The quality isn't high enough on this movie to crack the syllabus, but it was high enough to entertain me. I had a decent enough time with this movie. But the messaging in and of itself, wasn't that big of a problem with me. Like I explained before, it wasn't so egregious that it took me out of the movie too much. But the one thing that kind of did, and I'm a little bit spoiling the movie here, is the whole point of this meeting between the villain and the psychiatrist is that he's trying to get the psychiatrist to write his manifesto for him and deliver it to the world, like this weird, manifesto kind of detailing how screwed up the world is. And instead, the manifesto that gets released as a book called A Nefarious Plot, which is the book that Steve Deese wrote that this movie is based on. And it's supposed to be this book that will serve as a warning to the world. And you guys don't necessarily realize this because when you see it, it's all spaced out. But I clump videos together when I film. And so I have recently talked about Lady in the Water, the M. Night Shyamalan film, which stars M. Night Shyamalan as a writer who's going to write a book that's going to save the world. So that was very fresh in my mind when I was watching this movie. And that kind of took me out of the movie a little bit. Like that was a weird thing to see, like Steve Deese's book be the book that's going to save the world. That felt super heavy-handed. That took me a little bit out. So that one was a hard hurdle to get over. Again, it didn't ruin the movie for me. It still had a good enough time. But the movie is apparently looking to franchise out and become a whole franchise. I don't think we need that. I don't think we need more of this. Now, it's interesting because one of the reasons why this isn't really syllabus worthy is because it's not really that well known. There's not a lot of love for it. It doesn't have a big following as far as I can tell. It doesn't have great critical acclaim. But it did have some success on streaming. When it released on streaming, and I think it had a theatrical release first, which was, but then the streaming, it's found its success there. But they're trying to make a franchise out of it, and honestly, like I said, I don't think it needs a franchise. I don't think it's conducive to that. But if they did a franchise and it started to become big, well, then I might have to reevaluate this because then it would have some notoriety or notoriousness to consider or factor into the decision. But as of right now, where it stands by itself, it's not notorious enough, well known enough, loved enough to overcome the quality issues that make it fall short of the great movies that would be in the subgenres that it would want to be in. So, not going to make it on the horror movie syllabus. That said, I did have a good time with it, so thank you to Sky Cavelt for the recommendation. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. And I really do think it's worth watching, especially if you are the kind of person who can roll with this kind of messaging or doesn't have a big problem with it. It won't ruin the movie for you. Then go ahead and check it out. I think it's worth checking out for the interesting discussion and dialogue about religion. I thought that stuff was fascinating. But now, what's going to be fascinating is a horror trivia pursuit card. It's that time of the video where I'm going to ask a question off a trivia pursuit card live on camera, try to answer it, and see if I can get it right without embarrassing myself. And because of Nefarious's plot, what we're going to look at today is the paranormal category on the card. So, here's the question. In 2009's Drag Me to Hell, how many days will protagonist Christine Brown be tormented before being dragged to hell? I feel like I know this answer, but I'm also kind of unsure. I have seen Drag Me to Hell. We've talked about it on the channel. I think it's a great movie. Sam Raimi and Christine Brown, who is played by Alison Lohman, who is a grossly underrated actor. And the only reason I know that that's her name is because they told me in the card that she's the protagonist. So I didn't have a problem where I had recently where I assumed that the person they were talking about was the protagonist and it was actually somebody else. They're telling me Christine Brown is the protagonist, but more importantly, the question isn't really about her. It's about the concept of the movie. The movie being that she's been cursed by a Romani woman and having, to figure out how to survive the curse or beat it or whatever. And they have a certain amount of time. And I'm pretty sure I know what that time period is, but there's a little voice in the back of my head telling me that that's kind of an obvious answer. It's kind of like just the logical answer that you would think it would be, and that maybe that's not the case. Like it's almost a little too obvious, a little too easy to be the answer. So I'm having second thoughts on that, and I guess I'm prattling on a little bit to give you guys some time to think about it too. But I have a feeling that either you know it because you've seen the movie, or you're going to be guessing, and your guess is probably going to align with my thought process because again, I feel like there's kind of an obvious answer to this that just like if you know movies or just stories in general is the logical answer. And I'm kind of like I feel like I'm talking myself out of that answer, but we all know how that goes. I talk myself out of right answers too often, so we're not going to do that here. So the question was how many days? Lock in your answer. I'm about to answer my question right now. My answer is 3 days. I think 3 days. I think I just remember that from the movie, but also 3 days is just kind of like the obvious answer. It's always 3 days, right? It's always threes. It's always threes. America's got this obsession. People have their obsession with threes. It's a whole other diatribe for me. Like if you know me, you know my issue with trilogy. But side note, we'll talk about this some other day. Let's see if I'm right. Three is the answer. 3 days. 3 days. Yes. So I was right on that one. Man, I almost talked myself out of that because again, it's just a little too obvious. I think too easy of a question. Like even if you didn't see the movie, you didn't know the answer, you probably were going to guess 3 days, right? Like, so tell me, if did you guess something other than 3 days if you didn't know the answer? Because I'd be interested in knowing that. But that's our question. Got it right. Don't feel great about it because again, I felt like it was a little too easy, but I ain't gonna complain. I could use a win. I had some losses recently, so this is good. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I appreciate you guys sticking around if you have, and keep the recommendations coming. Like Nefarious was fun to watch. I enjoyed it. You guys have been giving me lots of great recommendations. Keep them coming in the comments below. Appreciate it. Appreciate you guys, and we will talk next week. Until then,